The FAA estimates that its air traffic organization handles 45,000 commercial flights in the United States every single day. There are 5,400 aircraft in the American skies at a time at the busiest times of a given day. 2.9 million people fly in and out of the United States airports every single day. And every single one of those people deserves to feel safe and be safe on those flights. Every single one of those people is entitled to know what went wrong in the mid-air collision over the Potomac River, which killed 60 passengers, 4 aircrew, and 3 soldiers on Wednesday. And every single one of those passengers deserves to hear the truth and a commitment to getting real answers from the U.S. president. One who can assure the public that the full power of the government will be brought to bear to ensure that the safest aviation regimen in the world will sustain, and that accidents like the one that happened on Wednesday will never happen again. Instead, here's what we got.
We do not know what led to this crash, but we have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now. I do want to point out that various articles that appeared prior to my entering office, and here's one. The FAA's diversity push includes focus on hiring people with severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing. And then it says FAA says people with severe disabilities are most underrepresented segment of the workforce, and they want them in, and they want them, they can be air traffic controllers. I don't think so. They put a big push to put diversity into the FAA's program. The FAA's website states they include hearing, vision, missing extremities, partial paralysis, complete paralysis, epilepsy, severe intellectual disability, psychiatric disability, and dwarfism all qualify for the position of a controller of airplanes pouring into our country, pouring into a little spot, a little dot on the map, a little runway.
I'm trying to figure out how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense, okay?
Okay, I guess. Aside from the fact that everything he just said is extremely offensive, it's irresponsible and it is a danger to public safety. At a time of tragedy and unbearable grief for 67 families, at a time when we need answers and assurances, President Donald Trump decided to blame a plane crash on DEI with zero evidence. Zero. Donald Trump implied that the laudable mission to achieve diversity in America caused innocent people to die, and it's nothing short of disgraceful. This is not a moment for hot takes, for speculation, for misinformation of any sort from anyone, but especially not from the president in a moment of tragedy. It's not just callous. It stands in the way of the real work that lies ahead. The only work now is to investigate this crash. And America, through the FAA and the National Transportation Safety Board, is the gold standard. The last fatal commercial aviation crash in the United States was in 2009, 16 years ago. We haven't had one since. And that's because of what we learned from that crash and the changes that were implemented in its wake. Colgan Air, then a feeder for Continental Airlines, Flight 3407, took off from Newark Liberty Airport in New Jersey and crashed just outside of Buffalo. There was light snow, fog, and sleet at the time. 50 people died, everyone on the plane and one person in the home that the plane crashed into. The families of the victims demanded answers and reform, and they got it. Exactly 1 year after the crash, the NTSB released its final report, which came to 46 specific conclusions. 46. That's how thorough the investigation was. That's how thorough they always are, because the experts at the NTSB don't have hot takes. They just do the work. The conclusions they arrived at included the fact that both pilots lacked experience with icing conditions. They possibly misread safety warnings, and they were both exhausted and fatigued. The first officer had flown to the departing airport in New Jersey from her parents' home in Seattle the night before. She made that commute on a cargo plane and rode in the jump seat, which is typically an auxiliary folding seat, not sufficiently comfortable for resting. After the crash, the FAA enacted sweeping changes to regulations. The FAA mandated more rest for pilots and increased the amount of hours of flight training experience needed for all pilots for every commercial flight in America. U.S. air travel has not been without incident since, but our skies have been much, much safer. A similar thing happened after 9/11. The U.S. had never experienced a terror attack of that magnitude using planes. At the time, we didn't know what we didn't know, but action was taken. Changes were made. The NTSB says the preliminary report on this week's fatal plane crash will be ready in 30 days. A full investigation may take a year. That's the time they need because they are experts. Changes will be made, and we will all be safer because of it. And we should believe them when they say that, and we should allow them the space to do their investigation without interference from anybody, but especially not from the president. According to a former NTSB investigator, the NTSB is the only agency allowed to release factual information about an investigation. The president, the defense secretary, the transportation secretary should not have been commenting on investigative matters. In the past, the NTSB has removed parties to investigations for doing exactly what we saw Donald Trump do. There are dozens of potential reasons why that helicopter may have collided with that airplane, and no evidence suggests that any of them have to do with DEI. The experts at the NTSB do not have answers right now, and neither does President Trump. Make no mistake, Trump's illogical and offensive accusations against disabled people or people of color or people with dwarfism, that was not in the pursuit of answers or solutions to this crash. This is just Trump's way of furthering his own political agenda, which is to disparage and dismantle diversity in America. He made the choice to stand behind that podium and blame whole groups of people, groups that are already marginalized in this country, for the deaths of civilians. No evidence, no facts, no truth. This might be a political game for Trump, but it affects real people in real time. In the hours after Donald Trump's press conference, a flurry of undue social media attention turned to a transgender pilot serving in the Virginia Army National Guard. Joe Ellis, a Black Hawk pilot, became the target of attacks and false claims that she was flying the helicopter that collided with the commercial jet. She was forced to post a proof of life video to Facebook in which she said, quote, "It is insulting to the families to try to tie this to some sort of political agenda. They don't deserve that. I don't deserve this." We all know that Trump has beef with DEI, and you can agree with him or you can disagree with him, but he cannot blame DEI for everything. Everything. Plenty of things went wrong in the United States before there was diversity, equity, and inclusion. Before companies and government agencies started prioritizing hiring more diverse and wholly qualified employees. Planes crashed when only straight white men flew them and directed them in the skies. And we didn't blame them for the failures or inadequacies or tragedies. We didn't blame them for their gender or race. We looked for why the crashes happened, and we solved for them. That's our work. When things go south, we leave it to the experts to get the evidence, to find out what went wrong, and to find solutions. Anything else is reckless endangerment of the American public. Joining me now, Eddie Glaude, Distinguished Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and author of several books, including his latest, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For, and Melissa Murray, Professor of Law at NYU, MSNBC legal analyst and co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast. Good morning to both of you. Thank you for being here. Melissa, you and I have had a conversation in an entirely different context about the Chevron doctrine and the Supreme Court helping to dismantle the administrative state. And we always struggle with the idea that I think the average American doesn't really talk about the administrative state all that often, but it's the idea that we have agencies that are filled with experts that make determinations and come up with regulations. This is a continuation of that. This is a president chiming in with information he doesn't have when, in fact, we have an infrastructure that involves the NTSB and the FAA that will get to the bottom of why that plane crashed, which is the reason why some of us will get on a plane today and some of us got on planes yesterday and the day before, even after a major airplane crash.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Ali. Elena Kagan of the Supreme Court has said that the administrative state is the way that we do government. It is government as we know it. We don't go to Congress to make regulations. Congress makes laws, but then delegates to agencies to make the regulations to enforce those laws. And that's basically how our government runs. Otherwise, it's too unwieldy. It's too big to actually be effective. And again, Congress doesn't necessarily have the expertise to regulate in a way that provides for the kind of safety and efficiency that we've come to expect from our government. But to link this to the president's attacks on DEI, it is worth noting that much of the administrative state is made up of a diverse workforce. 40% of federal workers identify as racial or ethnic minorities. So this assault on the deep state by what we might call the sheep state, because they're not questioning any of this, but that assault on the deep state is not simply an assault on the federal government and administrative agencies. It's also an assault on the many individuals who are people of color, who are women, who are disabled Americans, who are also working and providing those services to the public every day.
Without lowering any standards, because that's the mantra now, right? Pete Hegseth talks about it all the time. Why doesn't he like women in the military? Because they lower the standards for them. The president says when it comes to hiring, it should be about merit. Elon Musk talks about this all the time, that government agencies and companies need to, quote, restore the highest standards. This is it's a slogan based on a lie.
Right. Absolutely, Ali. And I think it's important for us to say that and to repeatedly say it. What was revealed in the president's press conference around the tragic death of 67 people was that DEI is a cudgel. It is what he uses to describe, shall we say, the diminishment of standards as he understands it. So there is an assumption, Ali, that by definition, if people of color, black, brown, if women, if people who are disabled, if they are in positions of authority, if they are in positions that have any sort of influence, standards are immediately compromised. And we have to understand that for what it is. It is a deeply offensive claim. It is a racist claim. It is a sexist claim. It's an ableist claim. And so what does it mean to agree with it? And I think this is what we have to begin to unpack. Now that we know what they mean by DEI, what does it mean for government agencies and for businesses to actually respond to this definition of DEI? They're conceding to what I take to be a white Christian nationalist agenda.
I apologize in advance to both of you because you are two of the most highly educated people we have on this show. So I'm gonna play you something from what Melissa, from what Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, said with respect to this crash, and then I'm going to ask you about it on the other end. Let's listen.
When you are flying on an airplane with your loved ones, which every one of us in this room has, do you pray that your plane lands safely and gets you to your destination, or do you pray that the pilot has a certain skin color? I think we all know the answer to that question.
I don't even know what the question means, let alone know the answer to that question. Creating some kind of dichotomy that we shouldn't value diversity over safety, which means I don't know what you think she's saying. I don't know what she's saying.
Well, it seems pretty clear that the question here is whether diversity can coexist with merit. And I think that answer, just simply based on this show, is yes, it can coexist with merit. It does coexist with merit. But this is something that this president and this administration has been absolutely assiduous in pushing, that these two values are absolutely incompatible. And whenever you have diversity, you have a diminution of standards. And that's simply not the case. I mean, again, we are talking about DEI just weeks after we confirmed an individual who, under the prevailing standards for the Department of Defense, would not have been confirmed as Secretary of Defense only 10 years ago. So, I mean, the whole question of whether standards has been lowered really does seem to be rich given this context. But I want to just emphasize this assault on the deep state, the connection of the administrative state with diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is about rolling back the gains of the civil rights movement. It's about eliminating a sector of employment that has actually been pivotal to African Americans and other minorities getting a toehold in the middle class. This is about rolling back those gains, rolling back that prosperity, and putting a group of people in their place. This is about reestablishing, re-entrenching a form of racial and gender hierarchy.
This is an important point, Eddie. Let's mine this a little bit, because there were far more plane crashes before there was anything called DEI, before we had diversity in the federal workforce, before there were any pilots other than the Tuskegee Airmen there were no commercial, there were virtually no commercial black pilots, there were no women. Planes crashed a lot more, and that has a lot more to do with technology and where we are and safety. We didn't blame white people for the crashing of planes, nor should we have. We learned how to investigate plane crashes carefully and properly and come up with recommendations. Now it's about something else. Now it's about standards and diversity because, as Melissa points out, we have a more equitable federal workforce.
Right. And we need to understand that shift for what it is. right? It is a decidedly racist and sexist and masculinist agenda. I think we need to be able to name it, Ali. We've been tracking prior to his election as president the influence of white nationalism, of white Christian nationalism on the Trump campaign. We were talking about its elements in Project 2025, and now we see it show up in policy, and we're not using the language. Why not? We're relitigating the mid-20th century. We're relitigating the Black freedom struggle. We're relitigating the women's movement. We're relitigating the gay liberation movement. We need to understand what's motivating it. And let's be clear, and I just have to say this, right? Every time the country tires of the quest for racial justice, it falls into this illusion, this fantasy of trying to get rid of us, of trying to move us to the margins, to banish difference. That's the only way a notion of American identity can cohere, is that whiteness must be its anchor. Whiteness and maleness must be its anchor. So we're right back where we have always been. This is the contradiction that has shadowed this country since its founding. And here we are barreling towards 250 years of America, and we're still grappling with the same nonsense, Ali.
So what do we do in the face, Melissa, of the evidence that's otherwise? When Pete Hegseth got sworn in and then made some comments afterward, he talked about the boys out there, and I always think about the men in the military. He kind of just skipped talking about women, fighting men and women. They are elected to Congress. Tammy Baldwin lost her legs as a helicopter. Tammy Duckworth, Senator Tammy Duckworth, lost her legs as a helicopter pilot. What is enough? What is enough to disprove Eddie's point that people come, they serve, they die, they provide their expertise, they get better educations? When is enough for America to not do what Eddie says we keep doing?
I think that's the $1 million question, Ali. It will never be enough, right? I mean, this whole assault on DEI, who is a DEI hire? We don't know who was hired because of DEI policies. The assumption is simply that any person who is a person of color or a woman with a high-ranking job is undeserving, got this job because of a racial preference or a gender preference, and should not be there. Took something away from someone else. I think we have to resist this narrative, resist this framing. I think we need to emphasize the idea that DEI is not about racial preferences. They constantly frame this in the language of race, but it's also about accommodating workers, making parental work leave policies more accessible so that all individuals can participate in paid work. It's much broader than simply the question of race or ethnicity or gender, and we have to emphasize that. At bottom, DEI is about making sure that no talent is left on the table. When we didn't have DEI policies, when we prioritized the hiring of white men, we were effectively looking at only half of the talent pool, which necessarily meant we were leaving talent on the table. If we want to be a truly great country, if we want to restore America's greatness, we can't leave behind talented people who could contribute to our society. And that needs to be the message. And frankly, I would love to hear some of our elected officials on the left start talking about this.
Well, we'll do that. We'll try and lead that conversation. Melissa, thank you. Eddie, thank you. Eddie Glaude is a distinguished professor of African-American studies at Princeton University, author of many important books, including We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For, a very timely book right now. Melissa Murray is a professor of law at NYU and an MSNBC legal analyst.